Look at it. 8.5 million people on a single island and the boroughs around it. 44 million visitors a year. More money moves through this city in a single day than most countries see in a month. 800 languages spoken on its streets more than anywhere else on Earth. You can get food from any country, hear music from any tradition, and find a community from absolutely anywhere, all within a 10-minute subway ride. From the air at night, Manhattan looks like a circuit board, a dense grid of light, impossibly bright, impossibly alive. The bridges stretch out in every direction like veins carrying blood. The Hudson on one side, the East River on the other. And in the middle of it all, those towers. Glass and steel punching straight into the sky, as if the city itself is refusing to accept that there are limits. This is the most famous city on the planet, the city that never sleeps, the city that swallowed the world's dreams and turned them into skyline. But here's the thing, 400 years ago, nothing. A quiet harbor, thick forest, a river full of fish. A handful of people living in perfect balance, with one of the most beautiful landscapes on the eastern coast of North America. So, how do you get from there to this? The answer is one of the most remarkable stories in human history. It involves greed, genius, fire, war, bankruptcy, and an almost insane refusal to quit. This is the entire history of New York City. Before the skyscrapers, before the noise, before any of it. There was a harbor. One of the most naturally perfect harbors in the entire world. A wide, protected bay where two rivers meet the sea. Forests thick with deer and beaver. Oyster beds so enormous that early visitors said you could hear them crunching under your feet. The air was clean. The fishing was extraordinary. The Lenape people lived here for thousands of years. They called the land Mannahatta Island of Many Hills. They fished its rivers, hunted its forests, and built a life perfectly fitted to this remarkable place. There were no massive cities, no stone walls, just people living in rhythm with one of the most fertile landscapes on the eastern coast of North America. Then, in 1609, a ship appeared on the horizon. An English explorer named Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch, pushed his small vessel up the wide river that would one day carry his name. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia. He didn't find one. But what he found instead would change the world far more dramatically than any trade route ever could. He found the harbor. Word got back to Europe quickly. The Dutch were the first to act. In 1626, a man named Peter Minuit purchased the island of Manhattan from the Lenape, the famous deal involving trade goods worth roughly 60 guilders. Whether the Lenape understood they were selling the land in the European sense is a matter historians still debate. What's not in debate is what happened next. The Dutch built a fort at the southern tip of the island. They called their settlement New Amsterdam. They brought in settlers, traders, and enslaved Africans to do the hard labor of building the colony. Within a generation, New Amsterdam was already one of the most ethnically diverse settlements in the Western Hemisphere. Dutch, English, French, Portuguese, African, and more, all crammed into a tiny fort at the edge of the known world. The Dutch weren't interested in building a perfect society. They were interested in making money. And in that spirit, they created something that New York has never stopped, being a place where commerce matters more than culture, where your background matters less than your hustle. But the Dutch weren't going to keep it for long. In 1664, 4 English warships sailed into the harbor. New Amsterdam surrendered. The English renamed it New York, after the Duke of York. Almost nothing else changed. The same merchants kept trading. The same streets kept their Dutch names. The same mix of nationalities kept doing business at the waterfront. And New York began to grow. By the mid-1700s, New York was one of the most important ports in the British Empire. Ships arrived daily from London, the Caribbean, West Africa. The economy was booming. The city was expanding north, block by block, up the narrow island. But trouble was building. The British kept imposing new taxes on the colonies. Taxes on tea, taxes on paper, taxes on everything. And New Yorkers, who had already proven they cared deeply about trade and money, were furious. The city became a hotbed of resistance. Sons of Liberty organized in taverns. Pamphlets spread through the streets. Tension was rising everywhere. Then came 1776. The American Revolution turned New York into a battleground. George Washington tried to hold the city against the British in August of 1776 and failed badly. His army was nearly destroyed in Brooklyn. He barely escaped across the East River in the middle of the night. The British occupied New York for the entire war, 7 long years. When the war ended, New York had a new beginning. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States right here in New York City, which briefly served as the nation's capital. Federal Hall on Wall Street was the stage. The whole country was watching. For one short moment, this city was the center of everything. Then the capital moved to Philadelphia, then to Washington, D.C., and New York, freed from political ambition, did what it always did best. It went back to making money. In 1825, something happened that changed New York and America forever. The Erie Canal opened, a 3-mile waterway connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. Suddenly, goods from the entire interior of the continent, grain from Ohio, furs from Michigan, lumber from the forests of the North, could flow directly to New York Harbor. The cost of shipping goods dropped by 90% almost overnight. New York exploded. In 1800, the city had about 60,000 people. By 1850, it had over 500,000. It was the largest, wealthiest, most powerful city in North America. Banks multiplied on Wall Street. Warehouses crowded the waterfront. Merchant ships came and went around the clock. The city that had started as a small Dutch trading post was now the financial capital of the Western Hemisphere. But with explosive growth comes explosive inequality. The rich built magnificent townhouses on Fifth Avenue. The poor, and there were enormous numbers of the poor, were packed into some of the most overcrowded, disease-ridden neighborhoods in the world. The Lower East Side, 5 Points, the Bowery. Streets where 10 people shared a single room, where children worked in factories, where cholera and typhoid swept through without warning. And then came the immigrants. Between 1840 and 1860, more than 1 million Irish arrived, driven out by the Great Famine. They came sick, starving, desperate. New York didn't welcome them. Signs read, "No Irish need apply." They were packed into the worst tenements, given the most dangerous jobs. They dug the sewers, laid the rail lines, built the foundations of a city that looked down on them. They stayed anyway. And they changed everything. The Irish were followed by Germans, Italians, Eastern European Jews, Chinese laborers. Each wave was resisted. Each wave transformed the city. Each wave eventually found its footing and became part of what New York was. This was the pattern. It would never stop repeating. The second half of the 19th century was when New York stopped being a city and started being a symbol. In 1858, Central Park was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, 843 acres, carved out of the middle of Manhattan, a green lung in the heart of a roaring city. The project displaced more than 1,600 poor residents who lived there. The park opened in 1876 and became one of the most visited public spaces in the world. In 1869, the Brooklyn Bridge began construction. 14 years later, in 1883, it opened. At the time, it was the longest suspension bridge ever built. People lined up from both sides just to walk across it. It connected Brooklyn, then a separate city, to Manhattan, and set off an annexation that would eventually bring all 5 boroughs together into one unified New York City in 1898. In 1886, a gift arrived in the harbor from France. The Statue of Liberty rose above the water, torch held high. For the millions of immigrants approaching by ship, she was the first thing they saw. She was a promise, or at least, she looked like one. In 1892, Ellis Island opened as the main immigration processing center. In the decades that followed, 12 million people passed through its doors. They came from Italy, Russia, Poland, Hungary, Greece, Syria. They were examined, questioned, tagged. Most were let through. Some were turned back. Those who made it in crowded into the Lower East Side. The density was almost unimaginable, 1,000 people per acre in some blocks, making it one of the most densely populated places in human history. Pushcart markets stretched for blocks. Yiddish newspapers printed daily. Synagogues and churches competed for space on the same street. It was overwhelming. It was alive. It was New York. The new century arrived with confidence. Skyscrapers were going up. The subway opened in 1904, threading the boroughs together underground. The Flatiron Building, the Woolworth Building, New York, was building higher than anyone thought possible. The city had 3.4 million people in 1900. By 1930, it had nearly 7 million. It was the largest city in the world. Jazz poured out of Harlem. The 1920s brought the Harlem Renaissance, an explosion of black art, music, literature, and culture that would reshape American identity. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. For a moment, Harlem was the cultural capital of the world. Then 1929 arrived. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Men who had been millionaires found themselves standing in bread lines outside churches. The Depression hit New York hard. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles appeared in Central Park. Unemployment was devastating. The city that had seemed unstoppable suddenly looked fragile. But it didn't stop building. The Empire State Building went up in 1932, 102 floors, built in just 410 days. It was finished ahead of schedule. New York was making a statement. We are not done. Factories ran at full capacity. Soldiers shipped out from Brooklyn. Women went to work in numbers never seen before. New York became the staging ground for the greatest military operation in history. After the war, something unexpected happened. The middle class left. Highways made it possible to live in the suburbs. White families, many of them, took the opportunity. The GI Bill helped them buy houses in Long Island and New Jersey. The city was left with the people who couldn't or wouldn't leave: the poor, immigrants, Black and Latino families who were systematically excluded from the suburbs by discriminatory lending practices. By the 1960s, New York was in crisis. Manufacturing jobs disappeared, crime began to rise. Neighborhoods that had once been working-class communities started to deteriorate. In 1968, the city nearly went bankrupt. In 1975, it actually did. The federal government refused to bail it out. The South Bronx burned. Not metaphorically, literally. Landlords, unable to pay taxes or make money on their properties, hired arsonists, or simply let buildings rot until they caught fire. During the 1970s, the South Bronx lost 40% of its housing to fire. Entire city blocks became rubble. It looked like a war zone. Out of that rubble, something extraordinary happened. Hip-hop was born. In the community centers and parks of the South Bronx, young Black and Latino kids who had nothing invented something entirely new. DJ Kool Herc threw a back-to-school party in August 1973 and isolated the percussion breaks on records. Grandmaster Flash perfected the technique. Africa Bambaataa turned it into a movement. Breakdancing, graffiti, MCing, DJing, 4 elements of a culture that would eventually become the most influential music genre in the world. New York, at its lowest point, had created something that would outlast everything. The 1980s were complicated. On one hand, Wall Street exploded. The financial sector boomed. A new generation of bankers and traders made enormous sums of money. Real estate prices skyrocketed. Luxury apartments went up in neighborhoods where people had been starving a decade earlier. On the other hand, the crack epidemic tore through communities that were already struggling. Homeless people slept in subway stations. The gap between the city's rich and poor had never been wider. Then came Rudy Giuliani and the cleanup of New York in the 1990s. New York, in the 1990s, was being reclaimed by money. Artists who had moved to cheap lofts in Soho and the East Village found themselves priced out. The same story repeated in Brooklyn, then Harlem, then the Bronx. The neighborhoods that poor people and immigrants had built were being sold back to people with 6-figure salaries. And then came the 11th of September, 2001. The city went silent. For days, Lower Manhattan was covered in ash and paper. Photographs of missing people were taped to every lamppost. Candlelight vigils burned through the night. The city that never stopped moving had stopped. And then, it started again. New York did what New York always does. It got up. It argued about how to rebuild. It argued about the memorial, the architecture, the politics. A new One World Trade Center rose from the site, 1,776 feet tall, a number chosen deliberately. The city kept going. Walk through New York today and the scale of it is still staggering. 8.5 million people, more than 800 languages spoken more than any other city on earth, entire neighborhoods where you can go weeks without hearing English. Jackson Heights in Queens, where you can walk one block through food from Bangladesh, Colombia, Mexico, and Tibet. Flushing, which has become one of the largest Chinese communities in the world outside of China. Flatbush, pulsing with Caribbean music. Astoria, still holding on to its Greek roots. Bay Ridge, where Arabic mixes with the smell of fresh-baked baklava. The financial district still processes trillions of dollars a day. The streets of Midtown still fill at rush hour with a tide of humanity that seems impossible to navigate. Central Park still holds 8 million people a year in its green arms. But New York is always fighting something. Affordability is the crisis of this era. The city that was built by immigrants and the working poor has become one of the most expensive places on the planet to live. A one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan can cost more per month than most Americans earn. The middle class is squeezed. The poor are being pushed further and further out to the edges of Brooklyn, to the Bronx, to Staten Island, and sometimes out of the city entirely. And yet they keep coming. Every year, more people arrive. From West Africa, from China, from Mexico and Central America, from South Asia and Southeast Asia, they come for the same reason people have always come. Because New York is still, despite everything, a place where you can reinvent yourself, where your accent doesn't necessarily close a door, where ambition is the currency everyone understands. Here's what's remarkable about New York's story. Every generation thinks they're the first to face an impossible situation. The Dutch thought the wilderness was unworkable. The colonists thought British rule was permanent. The immigrants of the 1900s thought the discrimination would never end. The people of the 1970s thought the city was finished physically, financially, morally finished. They were all wrong. Not because New York is magic, but because cities are made of people, and people given any kind of chance at all are extraordinarily resilient. New York's greatest building material was never steel or concrete. It was the stubborn, irrational belief of millions of people that it was worth staying, worth building, worth fighting for. That belief came from people who had nothing, who arrived on ships with everything they owned in a single bag, who were told, in 1,000 different ways, that this city wasn't for them. They built it anyway. And the city that exists today, messy, expensive, overwhelming, magnificent, is the result of every single one of those decisions. Every person who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Every neighborhood rebuilt after a fire, or a flood, or an economic collapse. Every generation that handed something, however imperfect, to the generation that came after. New York has never been finished. It has never been perfect. It has always been becoming. That's not a flaw in its character. That's the whole point. The question the city has always asked and still asks today is simple. Are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to stay and build and fight for something that might not reward you for a generation? Millions of people have said yes. And that answer, repeated across 4 centuries, is what turned a tidal marsh at the edge of a continent into the most famous city in the world.